We have to go now, baby. It's pouring. No! I can't leave him! Please, we must. It's too much. Daddy, don't make me leave!
There are people in this world who will sell anything to survive their own greed, their car, their pride, their self-respect, their last remaining thread of dignity. And most of the time, when we hear stories like that, we think we understand them. We tell ourselves that we would never go that far, that there is a line inside every human being that simply cannot be crossed, no matter how desperate things become. But every now and then, a story comes along that shatters that comfort completely. A story that forces you to sit with the ugliest parts of human nature and ask yourself, how does someone get there? How does a person look at a grieving child? A child who just buried her mother, a child who has already lost so much, and decide that child is a resource to be used? There are people in this world who will sell anything to survive their own greed, their car, their pride, their dignity. But what happens when someone decides to sell a person? Not a stranger, not someone they found on the street, but the child of the woman they swore to love, the daughter of their dead spouse. What kind of person looks at a 19-year-old girl standing at the edge of the worst grief of her life and thinks, I can use this? That is the question at the center of this story. And the answer is going to take your breath away. Not because it is simple, but because it is not. This is Emily. Today, she lives in a world most people only dream about. A mansion outside the city. A husband who looks at her like she is the most important thing he has ever decided to protect. A foundation she built from the ground up, named after her mother. A life that, by every external measure, is extraordinary. But the road that led Emily here did not begin in that mansion. It did not begin with a proposal or a wedding or a quiet morning over coffee. The road that led Emily here began in a hospital room in Columbus, Ohio. It began on the night her mother, Sandra, took her last breath. And it continued through one of the darkest betrayals a parent figure can commit against a child. Before this story ends with a queen, it begins with a transaction. Her stepmother gambled away everything Emily had, the insurance money, the family home, the jewelry passed down from her grandmother. Every last thing that Sandra had worked double shifts to preserve for her daughter, gone, traded away across felt-covered tables in underground rooms, where the rules only apply to the people who have already lost. And then, when there was nothing left to sell, when every account was empty and every debt had come due, her stepmother looked at Emily herself and decided that she too was something that could be traded. And the man who received her, the man who, by any definition, should have been the villain of this story, he became her husband. Stay with me, because this story is going to earn every single minute of your time. What you are about to hear is not a fairy tale. It is far darker and far more remarkable. Before we go any deeper into this story, I want to put 3 questions in front of you. 3 questions that I need you to hold on to as we move through the next 40 minutes, because the answers, when they finally come, are going to land differently if you have been sitting with the questions the whole time. The first question is this: how does a grieving teenage girl, a girl who just lost her mother, a girl who has done absolutely nothing wrong, end up becoming the property of one of the most powerful and dangerous men in the state? The second question is this: how does the man who accepted her, who participated in a transaction that, by any moral accounting, was completely indefensible, how does that man become the person she chooses to spend her life with? And the third question, the one that I keep coming back to, is this: when the woman who sold her finally comes back, years later, standing at the door of everything Emily has built, what does Emily do? I want to be honest with you about something. When I first started piecing this story together, I expected it to be a story about evil. I expected it to be clean and simple. A villain, a victim, a rescue. And in some ways, yes, there is a villain in this story. There is a woman who made a choice that I cannot defend on any level, a choice that would follow her for the rest of her life. But the part of this story that I was not prepared for, the part that kept me up at night and made me rethink my assumptions about people, was how complicated everything else turned out to be. Because Emily's story is not a story about someone being saved. It is a story about someone who refused, even in the worst possible circumstances, to stop saving herself. And that distinction matters more than anything else I am going to tell you today. Before we go any deeper, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And if you are not already subscribed, hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what you are about to hear is exactly the kind of story we exist to tell. To understand who Emily is today, you have to understand who Emily was before any of this happened. And to understand that, you have to start in Columbus, Ohio, in a house on a quiet residential street where a woman named Sandra Carter raised her daughter largely on her own and did it with a grace that people who knew her still talk about today. Sandra was a registered nurse. She worked at a community hospital for over a decade, pulling double shifts during the hard years, the lean years, the years when the mortgage felt too heavy and the grocery bill felt too high, and there was never quite enough left over at the end of the month. But Sandra never complained about that. Not to Emily. Not in front of Emily. She had made a decision when Emily was born that her daughter would grow up knowing what it felt like to be loved without condition, and she kept that promise every single day of her life. Emily's father, David Carter, was a long-haul truck driver. He was on the road more than he was home, and in the way of people who spend too much time in the in-between spaces of the country, on highways at night, in diners at 4 in the morning, in motels that all looked the same. He had developed a quiet, reflective character that people either found comforting or unreadable. Emily found him comforting. He called her his sunflower. He said it was because sunflowers are one of the only plants that actually track the sun as it moves across the sky. They turn their faces toward the light no matter where it comes from. He said that was Emily, even as a small child, always finding the light, always orienting herself toward warmth. The irony of that nickname, given what was coming, would not become clear to Emily until much later. When you spend your whole childhood being told you know how to find the light, it is a different kind of pain when everything goes dark. David Carter died when Emily was 16 years old. He had a cardiac event behind the wheel of his truck on a stretch of Interstate 75 in Tennessee. He was 41 years old. He was dead before the ambulance arrived. The truck crossed the median and jackknifed, and for several hours after the accident, before the identification was confirmed, Sandra sat in the hospital waiting room in Columbus, not yet knowing what had happened, just knowing that something had, because David had missed a scheduled call, and David never missed a scheduled call. Emily was at school when her mother got the news. She came home to find Sandra sitting at the kitchen table with her hands folded in front of her, very still, in the way of people who are containing something enormous. And Emily, who was 16 and already understood more about grief than most teenagers do, sat down across from her mother and waited. And Sandra told her. And Emily did not cry right away. She reached across the table and took her mother's hands and held them. And Sandra later told a friend that in that moment, Emily looked older than she had ever seen her. Older than 16. Older than anyone should have to look in their own kitchen. The two of them kept going. That is the thing about Sandra and Emily. They kept going. Not because grief was not real, not because the loss of David did not leave a permanent shape in both of them that nothing else would ever quite fill, but because Sandra was the kind of woman who believed that the way you honor the people you have lost is by continuing to build the life they wanted you to have. She kept working her double shifts. She kept saving. She kept the birthday cards on the shelf in the kitchen. She made sure Emily stayed in her art classes. She made sure Emily had what she needed to apply to college, to build something, to become the sunflower David had always believed she was. And for 18 months after David died, she did all of that alone, until the grief support group, until Vivian Cole came into Sandra's life at what was, in retrospect, the most vulnerable possible moment. She was warm in the way that immediately draws in people who are lonely and exhausted. She listened well. She remembered details. She brought food to Sandra's house after their first meeting and stayed for 3 hours, and Sandra called a friend afterward and said she felt like she had known Vivian for years. That is a feeling that, when it comes quickly and intensely, is sometimes a gift and sometimes a warning. In Sandra's case, it was both. Vivian did genuinely care for Sandra, by most accounts. The people who knew them both agree on that. What they also agree on is that Vivian was carrying things Sandra did not know about: debts, patterns of behavior, a relationship with risk that went far beyond what most people would call ordinary. But none of that was visible in the beginning. In the beginning, there was just a woman who made Sandra feel less alone. And for Sandra, in those 18 months after David died, that was everything. Emily did not trust Vivian from the beginning. She was 17 when Vivian first appeared, and she had the particular sharpness of perception that certain teenagers develop when they have experienced real loss early. A kind of radar for the difference between people who are genuinely present and people who are performing presence. She could not articulate what bothered her about Vivian. She told her school counselor, in a session recorded in her school's files, that Vivian smiled like she was hiding her teeth. The counselor wrote it down because it was the kind of thing you do not forget. Emily was not hostile to Vivian. She was not unkind. She was 17, and she loved her mother, and she understood that her mother needed something Emily could not give her. So she tried. She made room. She set her instincts aside as best she could, and she tried. Because that is what Sandra had raised her to be generous even when generosity was hard. Vivian moved in with Sandra and Emily about a year after they met. They married the following year, a quiet civil ceremony that Emily attended and stood through with a smile that cost her more than anyone in that room realized. By then, Emily was 18 and beginning her first semester at a community college in Columbus, studying graphic design, nurturing a dream of eventually transferring to a 4-year program, and doing something real with the talent she had been developing since childhood. She had a small group of close friends. She had a life she was beginning to build. She had her mother, who was the steadiest thing she had ever known. And she had the knowledge that Sandra had set aside a life insurance policy. $30,000, premiums paid out of double shift money over more than a decade, that was designated for Emily, for college, for the future, for the life Sandra had promised her daughter she would have the chance to build. Sandra had also preserved the family home. It was modest. A 3-bedroom house in a neighborhood that was neither wealthy nor poor, the kind of neighborhood where people mow their own lawns and wave to each other across driveways, and occasionally bring casseroles when something goes wrong. It was not worth a fortune. But it was paid off, mostly, and it was in Sandra's name. And Sandra had made it clear in conversation. Though not, it would turn out, in the right legal documents, that the house was meant to be Emily's. It was the last physical piece of the life that Sandra and David had built together. It was the last remaining structure of Emily's childhood. And when Sandra was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer, 20 months after marrying Vivian, Emily left her first semester of college and came home to help care for her. She did not hesitate. She did not weigh the cost. Sandra had kept her birthday cards on the kitchen shelf for 19 years, and Emily was going to be there for every single day that her mother had left. Sandra died 11 months after her diagnosis. She was 51 years old. She died in the hospital where she had worked for over a decade, in a room 2 floors above the ward where she used to pull night shifts, surrounded by nurses who had been her colleagues and her friends. Emily held her hand. She had been holding it, on and off, for days. When Sandra's breathing finally changed, when the room got that particular quality of stillness that people who have sat with the dying recognize immediately, Emily leaned down close to her mother's ear and said something that she has never repeated publicly, something private and complete, the last words between a daughter and the mother who had given her everything she had. And then Sandra was gone, and Emily was 20 years old, and Vivian was in the hallway on her phone. There is a version of what happened next that Vivian has told people over the years, a version in which she was overwhelmed, in which the debts that had been accumulating for years finally became impossible to manage, in which she made a series of desperate decisions that she did not fully think through, in which everything happened almost accidentally, one terrible choice leading to another in a chain she felt powerless to stop. I have heard that version. I want you to know it exists, because it is important to understand all of the dimensions of a story like this before you decide how you feel about it. But I also want to be honest with you about what the facts show, because the facts tell a different story than the one Vivian has preferred to tell. The facts show a pattern of deliberate, calculated behavior that began before Sandra died and continued long after. The facts show a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. What Emily did not know, while she was spending those 11 months sitting by her mother's bedside, holding her hand, reading to her, making sure she was comfortable, was what was happening on the other side of the house. Vivian had a gambling problem. That much is established. But the scope of it, the depth of it, the years it had been running beneath the surface of her life like water eroding a foundation, that was something Sandra had not fully known, and that Emily had no way of knowing. What the records later showed was that Vivian had lost 2 previous homes to gambling debts before she met Sandra. She had declared bankruptcy once in her 30s and come close to it again at 40. She owed money to people who operated in the parts of the economy that do not have customer service lines or dispute resolution processes. And for the entire last 8 months of Sandra's illness, while Emily was in the front of the house being a daughter, Vivian was in the back of the house being a person who had run completely out of options. She sold Sandra's car first. She told Emily it had needed too many repairs and that it was not worth maintaining. Emily had no reason to question that. She was focused on her mother. Then Vivian emptied a joint savings account that she and Sandra had opened together early in their marriage. An account that had a little over $4,000 in it. She told Emily the account had been used to cover some of Sandra's medical expenses. Emily had no reason to question that either. Then, at some point in the final 3 months of Sandra's life, Vivian located Sandra's jewelry box, the one that sat on the dresser in the bedroom, the one that held Sandra's good earrings and the necklace David had given her on their 10th anniversary, and, most importantly, the ring that had belonged to Emily's maternal grandmother. A simple gold band with a small diamond. Nothing spectacular by the standards of jewelry, but irreplaceable by the standards of what it meant. Vivian pawned it. She pawned all of it. The pawn shop receipt, which would surface years later, was dated 2 weeks before Sandra died. And then there was the insurance money, the $30,000 that Sandra had spent more than a decade building up. Dollar by careful dollar, premium by premium, for Emily. When Sandra died, the policy paid out. Vivian, as Sandra's surviving spouse, had access to the account into which the money was deposited. Emily was the named beneficiary on the policy itself. But in the weeks of grief and paperwork that follow a death, in the fog of loss that makes even competent people miss details, Emily did not immediately verify that the funds had been properly transferred. She trusted. That is the word that comes up again and again in this story. She trusted, because that is what Sandra had taught her. To lead with trust, to give people the benefit of the doubt, to believe that the people in her life were operating from the same set of values she had been raised with, and that trust was the last thing Vivian needed. Vivian took the $30,000 and walked into a private gambling establishment on the east side of Columbus within 3 weeks of Sandra's funeral. This was not a casino in the legal, regulated, neon-lit sense of the word. This was a private club, the kind of place that exists in the gray spaces of most American cities, the kind of place where a clientele is carefully selected and the losses are handled in ways that do not involve official channels. The kind of place where the house does not just take your money. The house takes whatever you have. Vivian had been there before. She knew the rules. She sat down at a table and she played, and for about an hour, things went the way she needed them to go. She was up. She thought, and this is the thinking of every person who has ever walked into a room like that, believing they had a plan, she thought she could double it. She thought she could clear her debts, replace what she had taken from Emily, and walk out clean. 4 hours later, she had lost everything. Every dollar of the money Sandra had saved for her daughter was gone. And when the last chip was pushed across the table, when Vivian was sitting there with nothing left in front of her, and a debt that had now grown rather than shrunk, a man sat down across from her. His name was Jackson Mercer. And in those rooms, in those parts of the city, Jackson Mercer was not just a name. He was the name. He was 34 years old. He had inherited a pharmaceutical distribution company from his father, a legitimate business, on the surface, that had expanded under Jackson into territories and methods that the DEA had been trying to document for years. He was known for two things: extraordinary wealth and a particular approach to debt collection that was creative, patient, and completely without sentiment. He did not threaten people. He did not need to. He simply waited, and he watched, and he found the thing that the person across from him most wanted to protect. And then he made them an offer around it. What Vivian offered Jackson Mercer that night. And I want you to sit with this, because it is the kind of thing that sounds impossible until you understand the desperation that produced it. What Vivian offered him was Emily, not in those exact words. She framed it as people who do terrible things often frame them, in language that softened the edges. She described Emily as a young woman who needed a structured environment, someone who would benefit from stability, someone who could serve as a companion and assistant in a household that needed managing. She was 19. She was grieving. She was alone. She had nowhere else to go and no one else to turn to. Vivian presented all of that as context. as justification, as a reason why this arrangement would be good for everyone involved. And Jackson Mercer, who had heard many things across many tables and who was not easily surprised, listened to all of it. And then he nodded, and the debt was canceled. Vivian came home that night, and she did not tell Emily anything. She made tea. She asked Emily how she was sleeping. She said she was thinking they might repaint the kitchen, that Sandra had always wanted to repaint the kitchen. Emily sat with her at the table and drank her tea and answered her questions and went to bed, not knowing that her life, as she understood it, had been signed away a few hours earlier in a room full of cigarette smoke and quiet desperation. She did not know. She had no way of knowing. She was sleeping in her mother's house, in the bedroom down the hall, from the shelf where Sandra kept all the birthday cards, trusting that the world was still the world she had been taught to move through. It was not. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday afternoon in October, Emily came home from a job interview. She had been applying for part-time work at a graphic design firm downtown, trying to figure out what her next steps were, how to get back on her feet, how to rebuild. She came home and walked through the front door and found two men she had never seen before standing in the living room. They were not large men, not obviously threatening in any physical sense. They were simply there in the way of people who know they have the right to be in a room and are not interested in your reaction to finding them there. Vivian was standing between them, near the window, with her hands clasped in front of her, in a posture that Emily later described as performed stillness. She said Vivian looked like someone who had rehearsed the scene in her head many times and was now simply moving through the version she had settled on. She did not look apologetic. She did not look torn. She looked like a person who had already completed the transaction and was waiting for the remaining paperwork to be processed. Emily stood in the doorway of her own home. The home her parents had built, the home Sandra had worked double shifts to preserve for her. And she looked at the two men, and she looked at Vivian, and she understood in the way that the body understands things before the mind catches up, that something had already been decided. She did not scream. She did not run. She asked Vivian very quietly what was happening. And Vivian told her, not everything, not the insurance money, not the jewelry, not the full scope of the debt. She told Emily only that there was a man who needed someone to assist him in his household, that Emily would be well cared for, that it was a good opportunity, and that it had already been arranged. Those were the words she used, already been arranged, as though Emily were a piece of furniture that had been sold while the previous occupant was still living in the house, as though her presence in her own life was a logistical detail rather than a right. Emily asked if she had a choice, and Vivian said, in the way of people who understand that the word choice still carries meaning, even when every actual option has been removed. Of course, you have a choice. Emily had two options as she understood them in that moment. She could walk out of the house with nothing. No money, no place to go, no network to fall back on, no safety net of any kind, into a city that did not know her name and would not stop for her grief. Or she could go with the two men Vivian had sent and at least find out who Jackson Mercer was before she decided what to do next. She chose the second option, not because she was powerless. She told me later, and I want you to hear this clearly. She told me later that she chose it because she wanted to look the man who had agreed to this arrangement directly in the eyes. She wanted him to see her. Not a transaction, not a solution to someone else's debt. A person, she said. I didn't know yet whether that was brave or foolish. I just knew I wasn't going to disappear without a face to remember. She packed one bag, She picked up the framed photograph of Sandra from the bedside table, the one from the summer before David died, when the three of them had driven to Lake Erie for a weekend. And Sandra had laughed so hard at something David said that she had spilled her iced tea all over herself, and Emily had caught the exact moment on her disposable camera. She put the photograph in the bag. She did not say goodbye to Vivian. She walked out the front door of her parents' house for what she did not yet know would be the last time she left it as a stranger to her own future. And the car that was waiting at the curb drove her 40 minutes outside the city. And the story that the world would one day call extraordinary had just begun its most dangerous chapter. The estate was nothing like Emily had imagined, though she would tell you later that she had not really been imagining anything on that drive. She had been sitting with her bag on her knees and the photograph of her parents inside it, and the particular kind of focused calm that comes when a person has decided to meet whatever is coming rather than to run from it. The gates were iron and high. The driveway was long and lined with trees that had been there long enough to form a canopy overhead. The house itself was large, not grotesque in the way of people who build to impress, but substantial in the way of old money, of a building that had been there for decades and had accumulated a certain gravity. Emily stepped out of the car and stood in front of it and thought she told me of the word lonely, not dangerous, not threatening, lonely. It was a house that had clearly been designed for a family and was currently housing one person, and the difference between those two things was written into every oversized room and every silent hallway. She was shown to a guest suite on the second floor. Clean, well appointed. Nothing personal in it, nothing that suggested it had been inhabited recently, or that her arrival had been anticipated with any warmth. A staff member told her that Mr. Mercer would see her in the morning and that dinner would be brought to her room if she wanted it. The door was not locked. Emily checked. She walked back to it after the staff member left and tried it from the inside, and it opened freely. And she stood there in the doorway for a moment, hold the handle, thinking about what that meant and what it did not mean. Then she went back to the bed and sat on it with her knees to her chest and stayed up until almost 3 in the morning, making a mental inventory of every resource she had, every skill she possessed, every possible avenue out of this situation. She was 20 years old, and she had just been handed to a stranger, and she was already planning. Jackson Mercer walked into the breakfast room at 7:15 the following morning, poured himself a cup of coffee, and sat down across from Emily with an expression that she has described to me more than once as difficult to read. Not cold, not predatory. She said there was something in it that she had not expected, something that sat at the edge of his composure and did not quite belong there. She did not have a word for it yet. He looked at her for a moment, and then he said, in a voice that was even and quiet and completely without performance, "You should not be here. I am sorry for that." Emily told me that she did not know what to say. She had prepared herself for a dozen different versions of this first conversation. She had prepared for intimidation, for arrogance, for the casual dismissal of her as a person that she had expected from a man who had agreed to a transaction like the one Vivian had proposed. She had not prepared for an apology. She did not trust it, but she heard it, and something in her went very still. That first breakfast was mostly silent. Emily ate and said almost nothing, and watched Jackson the way she would describe years later as the way you watch a person when you are trying to understand whether the surface matches what is underneath. She was not reassured by the apology. She was not reassured by anything in those first days. But she was also learning, slowly, that the monster she had constructed in her imagination on the drive over, the version of Jackson Mercer, that the rumors and the whispers and Vivian S. framing had assembled for her, did not fully match the person who was actually in the room. This did not mean he was good. She was clear about that from the beginning. It meant he was complicated. And complicated, Emily understood, was something she could work with. She had freedom within the estate, and that surprised her. She was not followed. She was not monitored in any obvious way. She had access to the library, which was extensive, and to the grounds, which were large enough that she could walk for an hour and still be on the property. She had access to the kitchen at any hour. The staff were polite and professional, and, she sensed, somewhat protective of her in a way that no one had directly acknowledged, but that she could feel in small gestures. The way the housekeeper always made sure Emily knew which rooms Jackson was in. The way the groundskeeper always nodded at her on her morning walks, as though confirming her presence was noted. She did not have a phone. She did not have access to money. She did not have contact with anyone from her previous life. But she was not in a cell, and she thought about that distinction every single day. The weeks passed, and something happened that Emily had not planned for, that she had not included in any of her calculations. She and Jackson began to talk, not about her circumstances, not at first, about other things. She had been reading her way through the library, and one morning he asked her what she was reading, and she told him, and he had read it too, and the conversation that followed lasted almost 2 hours. It was the first time Emily told me that she had talked to someone her own age. Jackson was 15 years older than her, but close enough, who seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts rather than in the version of her that he had acquired. She did not know what to do with that. She fought it. She reminded herself, regularly and with considerable force, of exactly how she had ended up in that library, in that house, talking to this man. She reminded herself of Vivian, of the two men in the living room, of the bag she had packed and the door she had walked out of. She reminded herself of all of it, and then she had another conversation with Jackson anyway. Because the alternative was silence, and Emily had never been a person who was good at silence. What she was learning over those weeks was a portrait of a man that the world outside those gates did not have access to. Jackson Mercer had grown up largely alone. His father had been a man of business in the cold, consuming way of people who have turned their ambitions into a substitute for everything else, children included. His mother had died when he was 11. He had gone to good schools and been competent at all of them and connected with none of them. He had inherited the company at 26 when his father died, and he had expanded it, and he had made the decisions he had made, and he had told himself what people always tell themselves when they are doing things they cannot fully defend. That it was the world as it existed, that everyone was playing the same game, that the alternative was someone else doing it worse. He had been telling himself that for 8 years, and it had gotten very tired. Emily asked him once, about 3 months into her time at the estate, why he had agreed to the arrangement with Vivian. She asked it directly, without softening, the way she had practiced asking it in her head for weeks. She said, "Why did you do it?" And Jackson was quiet for a long time. And then he said, "Because I did not think about what I was agreeing to until you were already here, and I should have." And Emily said, "That is not good enough." And he said, "I know." And she said, "Are you going to do something about it?" And he looked at her for a moment with an expression that she has described as the first time she saw something real in him. Not the polished surface, not the controlled exterior, but something underneath it that was still capable of being ashamed of itself. And he said, yes, yes, I am going to do something about it. It was in month 4 that the full picture came into focus for Emily. She was walking in the garden on a Monday morning when she overheard 2 members of the house staff talking near the kitchen window. A conversation they clearly believed she could not hear from where she was standing. They were discussing an account that had been accessed. They were discussing an amount. They were using Vivian's name. And Emily stood very still in the garden and listened, the way her mother had taught her to listen, completely, carefully, without letting the shock of what she was hearing close any of the doors in her mind. She listened until she had heard enough. And then she went inside and she sat down at the breakfast table. And she waited for Jackson to come downstairs. And when he did, she looked at him and she said, "Tell me everything, all of it, what Vivian took, what she told you, what you knew and when you knew it, every single piece of it. I want to hear it from you," Jackson told her. He did not minimize and he did not deflect. And he did not offer a version edited to make himself look better, which Emily noted. He told her about the insurance money. He told her what Vivian had said about Emily's situation that night at the table. He told her what he had known at the time and what he had not known, and where the line between those two things was, and he acknowledged clearly that even what he had not fully known had been willfully not examined. He did not cry. He did not perform remorse. He sat across from her, and he told her the truth, and he let her do whatever she needed to do with it. Emily sat with it for a long time. She did not yell. She had moved beyond the part of her grief where yelling felt like it would accomplish anything. She thought about Sandra. She thought about the birthday cards on the shelf. She thought about what her mother would have done in a situation like this. What Sandra, who had spent her career sitting beside strangers in pain and finding something human in every one of them, would have done. And then she said to Jackson, "I am not going anywhere until I decide to go on my own terms. But going forward, this is how things are going to be." And she told him exactly how things were going to be. And he listened. And for the first time in the story, something shifted. What happened over the following year inside those iron gates is the part of this story that I find most extraordinary, not because it was dramatic in the obvious sense, but because it was quiet. It happened in increments. It happened in conversations over coffee and walks through the grounds and evenings in the library, and the slow, careful process by which 2 people who have every reason to mistrust each other begin, despite themselves, to build something real. Emily had decided that she was going to reclaim everything that had been taken from her, and she was going to do it on her own terms and in her own time. And nothing and no one was going to rush that process or define it for her. Jackson had decided, and I believe, based on everything Emily has said and everything the subsequent record shows, that this was a genuine decision made by a man who had finally encountered someone who would not let him look away from his own choices. He had decided that he was going to dismantle the empire he had built and try to become a person he could justify. Jackson Mercer hired a lawyer, a good one, the kind whose name appears on the doors of firms that exist specifically to handle situations that are complicated and delicate and that require the ability to move through multiple jurisdictions without leaving the kind of paper trail that draws attention. The lawyer was tasked with recovering what Vivian had taken from Emily. This was not a simple process. It involved tracking accounts that had been carefully obscured, locating assets that had been moved and converted and dispersed. It took several months, but the insurance money was identified and legally reclaimed through a civil action that Vivian had neither the resources nor the standing to fight. The family home, which Vivian had been in the process of placing on the market, was legally returned to Emily's name before the sale could close. And the jewelry, what could be traced, which was most of it, including the grandmother's ring, was recovered from the pawn shop where Vivian had taken it and returned to Emily in a small box that Jackson placed on the breakfast table one morning without ceremony, without a speech, without any of the performance that the gesture might have invited. He just put it on the table and sat down and poured his coffee. Emily opened the box. She looked at the ring for a long time. She did not say anything for a while. Neither did he. She told me later that was the moment she understood something fundamental had changed, not just in her situation. In her understanding of Jackson, she said, "I know what it means when someone doesn't perform the good thing they've done. I grew up watching my mother do things for people at 2 in the morning that no one would ever know about and never once ask for credit. Jackson put that ring on the table the way my mother made extra food and left it at a neighbor's door. He wasn't doing it to be seen doing it. He was doing it because it was right." And for Emily, who had been raised by a woman for whom that distinction was everything, that meant more than anything he could have said. Emily turned 21 that spring. She had been living in the estate for over a year. She had begun, with Jackson's support and at her own initiative, to re-enter the world in small and deliberate ways, taking online courses toward the degree she had left behind, corresponding with the graphic design firm where she had once applied for a job, beginning to think about what she wanted to build and how she wanted to build it. She was not the girl who had been brought to that house in October with one bag and a photograph and a decision to look someone in the eyes. She was still Emily. She was still the sunflower. But she had grown in directions that neither she nor anyone else had predicted, and she had done it in conditions that would have broken someone who had not been built the way Sandra had built her. On the morning of her birthday, Jackson sat down across from her at the breakfast table. That table, the one where he had first apologized, the one where she had later demanded the truth, the one that had been the stage for so many of the turning points in their strange, unscripted story. And he said, "I don't want to be the story of what was done to you. I want to be the person who spends the rest of his life making sure no one ever treats you like a transaction again. If you'll let me." Emily looked at him for a long time. She told me she was thinking about every version of the future she had mapped out in her head over the past year, every exit route, every alternative path, every plan she had made and remade in the quiet hours when she was certain about nothing. And she told me she was thinking about something her mother had said to her once when Emily was about 15 and asking Sandra about love, about how you know. Sandra had said, "You know when the person in front of you makes you feel more like yourself, not less. You know when their presence clarifies something rather than complicating it." Emily looked at Jackson across that table, and she said yes, not because she had no other options. She had options. She had reclaimed them, one by one, over the course of a year. She said yes because she chose it. And the difference between those two things, between saying yes because you have no choice and saying yes because you have every choice and you are making this one, was the whole story. They married the following spring. It was a small ceremony, no grand production, no hundreds of guests, no spectacle, just the people who mattered in a garden that Emily had come to think of as hers on a day that was warm and ordinary and exactly right. Jackson wore a dark suit and looked at Emily with the particular expression of a man who is aware that he does not deserve what is in front of him and intends to spend the rest of his life trying to be worthy of it anyway. Emily wore a simple white dress and carried a single sunflower. She told me she did that for her father and for herself. Over the next 3 years, Jackson wound down the pharmaceutical empire, not all at once, not cleanly, not without cost. There were complications. There were decisions that required the kind of careful navigation that the average person never has to do. But he did it. Systematically, deliberately, at significant financial sacrifice, with Emily beside him, not as a passive observer, but as a genuine partner, asking hard questions and refusing to accept easy answers, and being exactly as honest with him as she had been from that very first breakfast. By the time it was fully done, they were both, in the specific way of people who have shed a skin they grew into without fully choosing, more themselves than they had ever been. Emily finished her degree. She transferred to a 4-year program and completed it, and went on to do the graduate work she had always wanted to do. And then she built the Sandra Carter Foundation, named for her mother, designed to do exactly what Sandra had always done: sit beside people who were in pain and find something human in every one of them. The foundation focused on young women who had experienced financial exploitation, family loss, housing instability, young women who were standing on the edge of something and needed someone to tell them. They were still the author of their own story. The foundation grew. It grew because Emily ran it with the same focused, non-performative commitment that Sandra had brought to her double shifts at the hospital. It grew because the need was real and the work was serious, and Emily was not interested in optics, only in outcomes. By the time the next part of this story happened, the Sandra Carter Foundation had helped over 200 women in 3 states. Emily was 25 years old. She had rebuilt everything. She had built things that had never existed before. She had kept every promise her mother had made for her, and made several more of her own. And then, on a Tuesday morning in April, the doorbell rang. Emily was in her home office, reviewing grant proposals, when the housekeeper came upstairs, with an expression she could not read. Emily would tell me later that she knew, before she was told, that something significant had happened. She said the housekeeper had the look of someone carrying news that they did not know how to frame, and that in her experience, that look meant the news was either very bad or very strange, and she braced for one of them. It was both. There were 2 women at the front door. One was older. One was younger, standing slightly behind the first, with her hands twisted together in front of her. Emily came to the top of the stairs and looked down, and, standing in the entryway of the house she had built, from the rubble of everything that had been taken from her, standing on the marble floor, beneath the painting Emily had commissioned in Sandra's memory, were Vivian Cole and her biological daughter, Mia. Mia was 23. Emily had met her briefly, years ago, a teenager then, peripheral to everything that had happened. A person who had been, in her own way, shaped by her mother's choices without being the author of them. She looked thinner than Emily remembered. She had her mother's eyes, but not her mother's composure. She was fidgeting with the strap of her purse and not quite meeting Emily's gaze. Vivian, standing beside her, was holding an envelope. She was thinner too. The years had not been kind to her in the way that years are not kind to people who are living with the weight of something they cannot put down. She looked up at Emily on the staircase, and she did not smile. She did not perform. She just looked. And Emily, standing at the top of her own house, looked back. Vivian asked to come in. Emily stood there for a moment. Jackson had come to the hallway behind her at some point. She was not sure exactly when. and she could feel his presence without turning around, steady and quiet and entirely hers to handle. She asked the housekeeper to put them in the sitting room. Then she stood at the top of the staircase for a while, very still, thinking. She thought about what it would cost her to go downstairs. She thought about what it would cost her not to. She thought about Sandra, who had spent a career sitting beside people in the worst moments of their lives and finding every single time a way to be present for them without losing herself in the process. She thought about what it means to be the kind of person whose mother named a foundation after her, and then she walked down the stairs. Vivian had brought a letter. 4 handwritten pages on plain white paper, the handwriting slightly uneven, in the way of someone who had started and started again many times before committing to a version. Emily read it there, in the sitting room, while Vivian and Mia sat across from her and waited. The letter did not ask for money. It did not ask for a relationship. It did not offer explanations designed to reduce Vivian's responsibility for what she had done. It said, in plain and unvarnished language, that Vivian had spent 6 years living with the full weight of what she had done to Emily and to Sandra's memory. It said that Mia had found out the full truth 2 years ago. Not from Vivian, but from a document she had stumbled across while helping her mother move, and that Mia's response to that knowledge had broken something in Vivian that she believed needed to be broken. It said that forgiveness was not what she was asking for, because she understood she had not earned the right to ask for it. It said only that she needed Emily to hear, from her directly, out loud, in person, that it was wrong, that Sandra had deserved better, that Emily had deserved better, that there was no version of what had happened that could be justified, and that Vivian was sorry, not in the way of people who are sorry they got caught, in the way of someone who had finally, fully understood what they had destroyed. Emily read the 4 pages without interruption. Vivian and Mia sat across from her and were quiet. When Emily finished, she folded the letter carefully and set it on the table beside her and looked up. She looked at Mia first, for a long moment, at this young woman who shared blood with the person who had sold her, who had been raised inside the same pattern of behavior without choosing it, who was sitting in a room she clearly did not know how to inhabit, with an expression of something that looked, to Emily, a great deal like shame on someone else's behalf. Then she looked at Vivian. She looked at her for a long time. And then she said something that I will carry with me for the rest of the time I spend telling stories like this one. She said, I forgive you, not for you. I forgive you because carrying what you did to me was never my debt to pay. My mother raised me to know the difference between holding on to someone else's shame and holding on to your own dignity. I am choosing my dignity. That was all she said. She did not invite Vivian back into her life. She did not offer money or future contact or any form of restoration of the relationship. She did not pretend that what had been done could be undone, or that forgiveness meant forgetting, or that the words she had just said erased the years behind it. She said what she said because she meant it and because she had decided, quietly and completely and a long time ago, that she was not going to let Vivian Cole define the shape of her heart. That decision was Emily's. It had always been Emily's. Vivian had taken many things from her. She had not taken that. Vivian and Mia left. Emily walked them to the door and watched them go. Then she went back inside and stood for a moment in the entryway of her house, underneath the painting of Sandra, and she was quiet. Jackson found her there a few minutes later and stood beside her and did not say anything, which was exactly right. There is a kind of love that understands when silence is the most useful thing it can offer, And Jackson had learned it the same way Emily had learned everything that mattered. Slowly, honestly, at real cost, and without looking away from any of it. There is an epilogue to this story that I think deserves to be told. Emily did not invite Mia into her life in any formal sense, but she did, through the foundation and without any announcement, arrange for Mia's name to come up in connection with a scholarship program. The Sandra Carter Foundation ran for young women in financial hardship who were pursuing degrees in healthcare. Mia was accepted. She did not know at first who had made the recommendation. When she found out, she wrote Emily a letter. Emily wrote back. It was one paragraph. It said, "Your mother's choices are not your choices. I watched someone make that distinction for me once. I am making it for you now." Mia is currently in her second year of nursing school. She has her mother's eyes. She is learning to have her own hands. The Sandra Carter Foundation continues to grow. Emily runs it with the same precision and the same refusal to perform generosity rather than simply practice it that Sandra brought to her. Double shifts at the hospital in Columbus. The shelf where Sandra kept the birthday cards is gone now, buried in the past with the house and the life and the version of the world that existed before any of this happened. But the values that produced it, the stubbornness of the love that built it, the belief that a person's worth is not determined by what is done to them, but by what they choose to do next, those are still here. They are what this story is made of. There are people in this world who will try to reduce you to a transaction. That was how this story began. I want to end it differently. There are also people in this world who, given every reason to become smaller and harder and less trusting and less generous, choose instead to become something else. Not because the circumstances earned it, not because the people around them deserved it, but because they decided, privately and completely, that their life was going to be authored by them. Emily Carter Mercer decided that at 19 years old, in the doorway of her parents' house, with one bag and a photograph and a car waiting at the curb to take her somewhere she had not chosen. She has been making that decision every day since. She was her mother's daughter. She was her father's sunflower. And she chose the light. Every single time, even in the dark, she chose the light. Was justice fully served here? Was the outcome everything it should have been? Was there a version of this story where no one had to become extraordinary just to survive ordinary cruelty? I will leave those questions in the comments because I think they are worth sitting with, and because the conversation that happens underneath a story like this one is part of the story. It always has been,